Yes. Yep. What? Okay, I'm getting it. I'm just listening to something too. But
hi, everyone. We are starting our lecture on Jewish life in the South. We're just waiting on people to file in right now. We want to go ahead and thank the Center for Jewish Studies, Florida Humanities, and the Price Library, who's providing resources related to each lecture. We greatly appreciate everything they're doing for us to make this lecture series happen. And I think for now, we've got everyone in here. So I'm going to turn it over to Eitan, who's going to introduce our speaker. So Eitan, you're unmuted, so take it away.
Thank you, Cassidy. My name is Eitan Oren on behalf of the board of JCNCF. I'm delighted to introduce Sylvia Gurinsky, a history educator and guide with quite an impressive background. Sylvia is a native of South Florida who's worked with numerous institutions, Flamingo Gardens, Miami-Dade County Women's Park, Florida International University, and Nova Southeastern University. She is also a co-host of the television series Roadside Florida, which is produced by the Lynn and Lois Wolfson Florida Moving Image Archives. Sylvia has a diverse background, having worked as a journalist for WPLG-Channel 10 and the Jewish Journal, as well as a guide for HistoryMiami Museum. Sylvia's many accolades include being a two-time winner of the Florida Associated Press Awards for editorial writing, as well as being a Peter Jennings Project Fellowship for Journalists and the Constitution at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. A lot of C's. Her passion for history is evident in her work, particularly her interest in the American Jewish history. In fact, Sylvia has a particular fascination with the Jews of the South. I saw while I was researching a class called Tropical Nosh on the food of Jewish food in South Florida, which I'm very jealous of. It looked so if that's any hint of what we'll get tonight, I'm very excited. A very vibrant history of Jewish South that we'll learn about tonight. So Sylvia, take us away and guide us through a great history. Thank you.
Thank you. And you got me now interested in researching the history of Jewish food throughout the entire state of Florida, not just South Florida. Thank you very much. And thank you. And Refuah Shalema, get well soon to Linda. That's who was directing the Nova Southeastern University Lifelong Learning Center. But I think I got to know her even before that, because we used to exchange emails back when I was at the Jewish Journal a few years ago. So I was very, very happy to do this. And a lot of connections here in the Jews of the South program. And what you're looking at, it looks to be a Simchat Torah service, but not just anyone. The cantor, her name is Jessica Roskin. And she was a cantor for a number of years at Temple Bethel in Birmingham, Alabama. And happy news, she just accepted an interim cantor's post at a synagogue in Charlotte, North Carolina. And she has a Florida background, in fact, a South Florida background. She was my high school classmate at the old Jewish High School of South Florida in North Miami Beach, which is now part of Hillel High School. Beautiful voice. And if you're interested in listening to her, you might be able to find, if you don't get up to Charlotte anytime soon, you might be able to find some of her singing on YouTube. And with that, okay, here we go. So you're looking at a picture. This is from a very different congregation a long time ago, about the turn of the 20th century in Mississippi. So the Jewish community has been in the South, in some parts of the South. You could go back almost 500 years in terms of Jews being there, not necessarily Jews practicing there, but certainly Jews being there. As far as practicing, that goes back almost 300 years, and we will get to see different parts. It covered 13 states in the southeastern United States, and we'll take a look at many of them. This is a synagogue in Texas, and today the Texas has it vies with Georgia for the second biggest population of Jews in the southeastern United States, about 150,000 Jews. Georgia in the same neighborhood. The biggest population, anybody want to guess? Which state has the biggest Jewish population?
Florida.
Of course, yeah, Florida. Close to 700,000 Jews, and of course, most of them down in this neck of the woods, Southeast Florida. Anybody want to guess the state with the smallest Jewish population?
Alaska.
Southeastern state.
West Virginia.
It's Mississippi, actually. Mississippi has about 3,500 Jews. But we'll see a lot of support from members of the Jewish community in that state, as small as it is. This is Gertrude Weil. I'll talk about her a little bit later, but all sorts of different kinds of leaders and barrier breakers. We will see how she broke barriers about a century ago, and among the women who broke barriers. And we see one of the marches with Dr. Martin Luther King and a number of rabbis in the civil rights marches of the 1960s. And we'll also see some rabbis from southern states who participated and who took an active role, in fact, risking their lives in doing so to advance civil rights. So here's a look at the Western Hemisphere circa 1600. And of course, the history of the Jews in the Western Hemisphere. The first Jews came to Recife in Brazil from Portugal. And the first, and you had, of course, the famous Jews of New Amsterdam in the 1600s. And here's a look at those early members of the Jewish community. You see I don't know if you could call them pilgrims, but they are wearing similar costumes to what we see. And they were bringing their traditions over. Jews, as well as others, were trying to escape from the land that was held in particular by Spain during the Inquisition. But there were also restrictions by the French and English on the practice of Judaism. So even many Jews who were starting to sail over here could not openly practice. Of course, there is what we're learning now about what are now called crypto Jews, people who are trying to trace their Judaism back if they are particularly of Spanish or Portuguese heritage. And the colonial members of the Jewish community starting to set up in the southeastern area, again, as territories, as most of them as British colonies. Florida was a territory of Spain, briefly of France, then Britain and Spain again, Louisiana, and many of the other areas, part of French territory, Texas, part of Spanish territory as well. So you're looking at Roanoke Island in what we know today as North Carolina. And a lot of people would look at this as the site for maybe the first Jew who was an open Jew who stepped on the land. And his name was Joachim Gans. And you see, this is a marker that is from, pardon me. and Jewish native of Prague, and led metallurgy experiments at Roanoke at the request of Queen Elizabeth I. And one of the reasons for this marker was actually dedicated a few years ago, 2019. And one of the reasons that North Carolina dedicated this marker is because of the archaeological digs that have been going on in the area. And in the 1990s, they found evidence of Gann's laboratory and his work. Now, they found the evidence of his work here, but what they have not found is any evidence either at Roanoke or back in Europe, where he went after only about a year, of Gann's himself. There are questions about what happened to him. There are speculations that people who may have found out about his Judaism may have killed him. They just don't know. Again, still trying to find out, but the study here led to this historic marker. So you're looking at what we now know as South Carolina. And South Carolina would probably see the establishment of the first open Jewish community in the Southeast. Again, while South Carolina was a British colony. And you see the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. It took a while for the British to embrace the open practice of religion, but John Locke's writings would push them to it. And so you had the establishment in the 1730s of the first congregation in the Southeast, Kahal Kadosh Beit Elohim in Charleston. And this is not, the building that you see is not the first synagogue. That was a wooden synagogue that burned down in a fire. And this one actually dates to later in the 18th century. It's considered the second oldest synagogue building in the United States, behind the congregation in New York, and and the Torah synagogue, so it might be the third oldest. And it is considered neoclassical style, so it is the oldest synagogue of that style, and it is the oldest working synagogue in the United States, because the others are currently museums, I believe, but this one's still a working synagogue. Here's a look, an illustration, of course, of Juan Ponce de Leon, landing, in this case, in Pensacola. There's still debates going on over which parts of Florida he actually landed in. But of course, the Spanish would land in both La Florida, I'll talk about Florida in a second, and Georgia. And then the British would come to Georgia. Of course, any Jews who came on the expeditions, the Spanish expeditions to Georgia, could not practice. That would change with James Oglethorpe, and again, Georgia, British colony afterwards, and Jews began openly practicing. Antonio da Costa. Now, he has a name that would make you think, oh, he's from Spain or Portugal, but he actually seems to have been Dutch. So he may have been descended from people who went to Holland and left Spain or Portugal. And he was a founder of Georgia's Jewish community. And look at this, some of the early Jewish settlers of Georgia. Again, a lot of people still coming on the ships from Europe. Now, who was the first Jewish elected official in the United States? The first Jewish governor in the United States? There's an argument for David Emanuel. Here's a marker for Emanuel County in Georgia. And now it talks about a little bit about David Emanuel, and he was briefly the governor. But there are questions about whether in fact he was Jewish or not. There are arguments, some scholars who say yes, he was, and other scholars who say no, he wasn't. And the study is still going on. And you're looking here, this is a map from, say, circa 1800, say, about of Savannah. So Savannah followed Charleston in establishing a Jewish community. And you're looking at also one of the oldest congregations in the South, Mikveh Israel, established in Savannah. Now, the congregation, as with the one in Charleston, dates from the 1700s. The synagogue, though, dates from the second half of the 19th century. So the later 1800s, and it's considered the only Gothic revival synagogue in the United States. And this too is a working synagogue, not just for services, but also headquarters for organizations such as their local chapter of B'nai B'rith. And so we come to Florida and a map of Florida under British control when it was divided in two, with East Florida with the capital St. Augustine, West Florida the capital Pensacola, and what I like to refer to as the angry alligator of South Florida before the British in the 1770s did the surveying that really updated people about what the coast looked like. But the British were the ones that saw first, even though there may have been surreptitiously a Spanish territorial governor named Marquez, who may have been Jewish during Spain's first possession of Florida. It was in 1763 when the British held Florida that the first openly practicing Jews would come. The Jewish Museum of Florida, which is located at the Old Beth Jacob Synagogue in Miami Beach, features this history in its permanent exhibit. And the Jews were able to openly practice until the Spanish got its second possession of Florida at the end of the American Revolutionary War, and held it for almost the next 40 years. So Florida would actually have to wait more than a century for its first official synagogue, Bethel in Pensacola, which was not created until the 1870s rather. Here's an illustration, George Washington and the troops during the American Revolution, and a number of members of the Jewish community, including from the southern states, the newly established southern states, fighting for the new nation. And one of them, Francis Salvador. And he has been seen as the first person from South Carolina who was Jewish to hold public office. You see the marker there. He was one of the people who could also communicate between the Americans, and even before the war, the British, and the Creek Indians that were in South Carolina. So strong diplomatic skills, but alas, would become the first Jew also to die in the American Revolution. Here's a map of Louisiana from the French, and French territory, of course, before the Louisiana Purchase of the early 1800s. And as a French territory, the Catholic religion ruled, and there were the restrictions there that were called Code Noir, literally the Black Code, that was seen as restricting anybody who was not Catholic from being in the government, from running the government or having a lot of rights, and against slaves too. Though France would actually end slavery along with England long before the United States did. And this also restricted Jews from holding office. So an updated map of Louisiana, and again, the Louisiana Purchase that took place during Thomas Jefferson's presidential administration. And more Jews would start to settle in those areas, although a lot of these areas would not see established Jewish communities until well after the Civil War. And it's true of Florida too. So Avram Mordechai in Alabama, and also one of the first Jewish citizens established in Alabama. And he had a very long life at a time when that was very unusual, dying after about 94 years of life. And in different ways, he served not only in the Revolutionary War, but also as assisting with the War of 1812. Now, it says, living and marrying among the Creeks. He was of the opinion that the Creeks and other natives were among the lost tribes of Israel. And he even thought he tried to teach them Hebrew and married a woman from the Creeks there, but and wound up still practicing Judaism. So that in pioneering in Alabama's history. Now, the Levy family or Levy family that ran Thomas Jefferson's Monticello would run Monticello well into the 20th century, different generations, and in fact is credited with preserving Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home, as it was to transition into the public historic site it is today. The most famous member of the family, Uriah Levy, who was in the Navy, officer in the Navy, and broke barriers by moving to abolish flogging, which was done to members of the Navy who did not obey orders or who had been accused of violating orders. Now, after he did that, he also faced anti-Semitism, and he was penalized. He was stripped of his officer status. And then during the presidency of US President John Tyler, Tyler reinstated Levy to his full rank and title and duties. Now, Judah Toro, and of course the Toro family, very prominent, particularly in Rhode Island. We know of the Toro Synagogue, the historic Toro Synagogue in Rhode Island. Also Toro College in New York. I think there are also campuses in other parts of the country. And he was from family. His father basically backed the wrong horse during the Revolutionary War. His father was supporting the British. The British had appointed him in lucrative circles. And the family wound up going to Jamaica for the duration of the war, then came back. Judah Toro was a boy. He served in the War of 1812 and was wounded. And one of the results of this was that he became something of a recluse, concentrating mainly on business and philanthropy. And Toro is seen as one of the people who would try to help slaves by purchasing them and then transporting them north in order to free them. There are still, again, studies tracing how this was done. He lived in Louisiana. And again, research going on for Judah Toro's participation in that. Now you're looking here, this is a prayer book coming from, you can see the printing there, from Germany, 1842. And the first major immigration of Jews into the United States after independence comes from Germany, some other parts of Europe too, circa the 1840s. This was at a time there was some moving to New York. The vast majority of Jews at the time were actually moving into the Midwest, Cincinnati, Chicago, other parts of the Midwest. Some were going again out west after 1850, after the gold rush. Many went to California, but also a number of Jews coming into the southern United States. And you see, again, there was a support system that had come up for a lot of the immigrants, people who supported them. Abraham Block, who lived in Arkansas, was among the philanthropists who had business, who helped support other Jews there. There is, I believe, a state park that is named for the Block family there. I'll concentrate first on the woman over here, Rosanna Osterman. Do we have here our people from Texas? You can put up the little symbols if you are you are present here. Rosanna Osterman, one of the members of the founders of the Jewish community in Galveston, Texas, and worked in dry goods. Also, she and her husband had that. Her husband also assisted the Borden family, if you know Borden dairy products, in creating what became evaporated milk. Now, she also nursed during the Civil War. She was said to have nursed soldiers from both the Union and Confederacy. There are questions, debates, research still going on about whether she used her nursing work to spy on Union soldiers and help the Confederates keep control of Galveston. Jury's still out on that. They're still doing research. And she died, though, a year after the end of the Civil War in 1866 in a boat fire. So she is remembered for the different things she did in Galveston. In the middle, Benjamin Gratz and the Gratz family from Philadelphia, also a philanthropic family, the most famous member, Rebecca Gratz in Philadelphia. And Benjamin Gratz came down to New Orleans, and there are questions about whether he was a slave owner, debates and research going on about whether he did what Judah Turo was said to do, which was to buy slaves in order to transport them to freedom. But again, research still going on that. Now, the Jewish community, the Southern Jewish community, may have had a prominent actress. The jury is still out on whether Ada Isaacs Menken was herself Jewish. She was married. She was married multiple times. One of her husbands was Jewish. She gave interviews in which she felt strongly expressed support for Jewish traditions and said she felt comfortable practicing them. Stage actress, of course, during mid-1800s from Louisiana as well. And she became among the first in the acting profession to take advantage of the new technology of photography. So much photographed, and she kind of had a life much like you would see from a 20th or 21st century member of the acting profession, with multiple marriages. Sadly, 2 infants died in childbirth. And sadly, she died relatively young too, only at the age of 35. So comparable to some of the actresses you would see later that had the very showy and yet very tragic lives. Now, here's a look at the page, Avadim Hayinu, because we were slaves, from a Passover Haggadah, because with a lot of the people who lived in the South leading up to the Civil War, the question of any support of slavery. Did they own slaves? Did they support slaves? And a few years ago, the Jerusalem Post tackled the subject. Jews alternatively participated, co-opted, and resisted slavery. And it says, while a small number of Jews took part in the transit of slaves to America, British government records demonstrate that Jewish slave owners owned less than 2% of the slaves imported into North American ports in the 1700s. After the United States declared the slave trade illegal in 1808, no Jews took part in the illegal smuggling of slaves that arose afterward. And playing an equally small role in the domestic sale of slaves. 4 Jews listed in Charleston who were slave traders. Only one of these men, Benjamin Cohen, was part of the list of the 13 most lucrative traders in 1860. In terms of ownership, none of the South's largest cotton producers, rice planters, or the large-scale sugar planters included Jews in the cities of Charleston, Savannah, Richmond, and New Orleans. Jews owned less than 2% of the slaves. While rabbis in these cities either remained silent or supported slavery, other Jews crusaded against it. A lot of them coming from the north. You'll see a little more about you'll see a picture of Rabbi Einhorn just a second. Baltimore, rabbi denouncing slavery as this cancer of the Union. Maryland was a slave state that later remained in the Union during the Civil War. For his stand, Einhorn and his family received death threats and had to flee to Philadelphia. Southern Jews like Joseph and Isaac Friedman in Alabama, Judah Toro in New Orleans, and Lazarus Strauss in Georgia risked their lives to spirit African Americans to safety. And you're looking at the rabbi. This is Rabbi on the my right side, the right side of the screen, Rabbi Einhorn, again from Maryland, speaking out against slavery. And Rabbi Rafal from New York, who did not speak out against slavery, and questions about whether he was an advocate or whether, and by the time he finally came out and said this shouldn't be happening, they were about halfway through the Civil War. Here's Joseph Friedman, who was mentioned in the article, along with his brother Isaac, merchants in Alabama. And they were among the people, again, as the article stated, who purchased slaves. They transported, in one case, a man named Still to Ohio. The Friedmans did not go back to Alabama after that. They stayed in Ohio after that. And Still had a brother who was involved, one of the people along with Harriet Tubman, who was part of the Underground Railroad, rescuing and transporting slaves to freedom. Now, there were efforts in the southern areas to counter slavery. And one of them came from Moses Elias Levy. Moses Elias Levy, born in Morocco, and born in a family whose name was Aben Yule. This was a family that had originally been kicked out of Spain during the height of the Inquisition. He made his way west, went to Cuba at one point, and came to Florida and established near Micanopy what was called Pilgrimage Plantation, kind of considered an attempt at a kibbutz, trying to encourage other Jews to come practice Judaism, farm, and he set it up as free territory, no slavery. And this was during a time when Florida was not yet a state, but a U.S. territory. But it ran up against, first of all, a Jewish community that was not interested in coming to a place infested with mosquitoes to do any farming. And secondly, ran up against the Second Seminole War, which began in 1835. So Moses Elias Levy ultimately stopped Pilgrimage Plantation. Now, his family included a young son that he sent to Virginia for an education, including a legal education, David Levy. And David Levy, very different, butted heads with his father, including over slavery. He was a territorial representative from Florida, and when Florida became a state in 1845, David Levy became the first Jewish senator in the United States, first Jewish senator from Florida. And he also decided to, even though he was not speaking very much with his father, he decided to honor the family legacy by adding Yulee to his name. So David Levy Yulee. These days, of course, Florida has Levy County and the town of Yulee. And curiously, while he supported secession and supported slavery, when the Civil War started, he never did serve in any kind of Confederate government. Now, a little bit too, let me see if I can. 3 Jews accompanying John Brown on his raids in Kansas against pro-slavery settlers. The archives of the American Jewish Historical Society contain a 1903 letter in which one of them, the Viennese-born August Bondy, recalled an exchange between himself and Theodore Weiner during one of the posse's first attacks. As they followed Brown up a hill to assault a border ruffian camp, Bondy wrote, "Weiner puffed like a steamboat hurrying behind me. I called out to him, 'Nu, was meinen Sie jetzt?' What do you think of this?" His answer was, "Soll ich meinen, sofort moves." Arguably German, yet maybe, but possibly Yiddish being spoken during John Brown's famous raids. Now, again, thousands of Jews in the Union Army. I think about 8,000 Jews in the Union Army and about 2,000 in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. As with families in other circumstances, there were some Jewish families that were split up by the war. There was, I believe one of those stories is about President Lincoln having an aide. I think the Jonas family, in fact, was from Kentucky. Abraham Jonas, trusted friend of Lincoln's, and who passed away during the war. Jonas's son had fought for the Confederacy, was a prisoner of war, and Lincoln had him released so that he could come and mourn his father properly with the Jewish funeral ceremony. Now, the most famous or infamous of the Jews during the Civil War, Judah P. Benjamin, who had served before the war. He had been a U.S. Senator from Louisiana, had turned down efforts to get him to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court, and had even at one point had almost gone to a duel with Jefferson Davis. This was in the pre-war era. And of course, their relationship would change significantly after the war began. Treasury Secretary and other high-level positions, and also sought in earnest as the war ended, and he fled gradually. And there's a whole historic trail, including the Gamble Plantation, an hour north of Tampa, where he would eventually get to Cuba and then go to England, where he would practice law there, live there and practice law the rest of his life. Now, he married a non-Jewish woman, his children were not raised Jewish, and he did not openly practice for much of his life. And yet, a lot of mid-20th century Jewish history books focused extensively on his biography. There's one book that's behind me here from 1956, and quite the loving description of him, along with other Jews. But again, the legacies being studied. Now, the worst moment that the Jewish community as a whole would find during the Civil War, General Orders Number 11, which came from Union General Ulysses S. Grant, which was basically trying to kick the Jews out of Kentucky, Tennessee, and other areas in the South. And one of the genesis of this particular order was family competition. Ulysses Grant's father was a merchant, and Grant evidently believed that his father was losing business to Jewish merchants in the area, and he decided to use this as an opportunity to kick out the Jews. Some of the members of the Jewish community that left Paducah, Kentucky, went straight to Washington and straight to the White House. They met with President Lincoln, who promptly overturned the order. And the order had a lasting legacy. Julia Grant, Ulysses S. Grant's wife, would refer to it forever after as that obnoxious order. And a few years later, when Grant was running for president, he said, he gave basically his version of an al-chet for the order, said, "I goofed, I should not have done that." And he got a majority of the Jewish vote, even with a vigorous campaign against him for the presidency. And Ulysses S. Grant really would do a 180 in his life on the Jewish community, because later in his life, he was interested in visiting Israel. He would also, as president, visit the synagogue in Washington that's been called the Synagogue of Presidents. Now, Texas. And I mentioned the community of Galveston starting to develop. Texas, most of the Jewish communities would begin to develop in the second half of the 1800s in Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, different places. Now, the Jewish community of Tennessee had developed. Memphis, Tennessee was one of the biggest Jewish communities, but in the 1870s came a terrible yellow fever epidemic, what was known there as the Yellow Terror. And this was one of the first instances in which a nationwide campaign involving the Jews across the United States was taken to try to help and support the Jews of Tennessee to get through this. For example, Memphis lost roughly 85% of its Jewish population, either dying of the disease or leaving Memphis to go to other places without the illness. Jews in other parts of the country, in the Midwest, in New York, other parts of the South, and in the West, would raise money to help these people. Now, this Sunday law, it says Ontario, but I use it just as a reflection of the Sunday laws that were in place in the South, and in fact, in a lot of parts of the United States for many years and well into the 20th century. These laws meaning that since Sunday was considered a Christian Sabbath, nobody could open a business on a Sunday. And of course, this proved a tremendous challenge to members of the Jewish community in the South and across the country who would extensively go into court to try to challenge these rules. And it was really starting in the second half of the 20th century that these Sunday laws, or blue laws as they were called, started finally to come down. Second half of the 1800s and the turn of the 20th century saw a rise, tremendous rise, in the Jewish community's involvement in the retail trade. Here in Tampa, Abraham and Isaac Mas, immigrants, I believe from Poland, and they had established a dry goods store in the 1870s, starting in Tampa, would expand gradually. Here you're looking at circa 1910s, 1920, the flagship Mas Brothers store. Eventually, Mas Brothers would spread through Central Florida. I think Gainesville may even have had one, and would run through much of the 20th century. Became part of the Allied family of stores and would eventually merge with Jordan Marsh. I remember the Mas Brothers, this logo was joined by the Jordan Marsh logo throughout the 1980s. And then Campo, running Federated Department Stores, took them over and sadly closed down Mas Brothers and Jordan Marsh around 1990-91. Now we'll get back to a little more retail in just a bit. Mark Twain, of course, establishing his prominence as the great American writer. And in 1898, he wrote an extensive essay about the Jewish community. His attitudes, he was always sympathetic, at least in some form, to the Jewish community, but would educate himself on various issues. This essay did not reflect, for example, the military service that members of the Jewish community had given. He would learn about that. And also that he still had to educate himself about the Dreyfus affair and the aftermath of that. And of course, Twain would travel to the Holy Land. I think PBS had a program about that a few months ago. Hopefully they'll show it again about Mark Twain in the Holy Land at that time. And of course, late in life, the friendly correspondence with the Yiddish writer Shalom Aleichem, who was called the Mark Twain of Yiddish writing. And Twain would joke, I guess this means I'm Shalom Aleichem of American writing. Now, Adolph Oakes, who would set standards for journalism and came to Chattanooga and established the Chattanooga Times. In 1878, he would start to, while yellow journalism was so prevalent in American newspapers, he would start to go in the opposite direction. He separated business from editorial and would start to really set standards. And the Chattanooga Times, the things that he did with the Chattanooga Times would set him up in 1896 when Adolph Oakes purchased the New York Times. And of course, today, his descendants, the Sulzberger family, continue to own the New York Times to this day. Adolph Oakes continued in Chattanooga as a philanthropist, supporting all sorts of educational and cultural entities. And in fact, in 1936, he was in Chattanooga when he died. He was on the job visiting the Chattanooga Times. Barney Dreyfus, who was one of the immigrants who came in the late 1800s and moved to where some relatives were in Kentucky, and got involved in liquor distillery and was running that business, learned the distillery business, but also learned about something new, baseball, because the distillery business was one of the local businesses where employees would gather on the weekends and play baseball. And he came to own a team in Lexington, Kentucky, that he feared would go out of business. So he traded it off and decided instead to buy the Pittsburgh Pirates. Dreyfus would own the Pittsburgh Pirates until his death in 1932. You see there a scorecard from the first World Series, where the Pirates played and lost to the Boston Pilgrims. They were called the Pilgrims then, not yet the Red Sox, representing the National League. Pittsburgh would be a pretty successful team almost up until his death, and played in another couple of World Series. And in 1910, Dreyfus built for the Pirates Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, which was to be one of the innovative stadiums of the time, the second generation of stadiums that would start to leave behind the wooden fire traps that had been part of the late 1800s, and would be foreshadowing the other stadiums that would come a couple of years later, such as Wrigley Field and Fenway Park. The Pirates played in Forbes Field until it was torn down in 1970. Now, even for all of Dreyfus's contributions to baseball, he was not inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame until about a decade ago. Hard to say exactly why, but a lot of people argued that he was a gentleman and had deserved to go in. Could it have been anti-Semitism? Maybe in the early years, but hard to say after Hank Greenberg and Sandy Koufax and others had made their contributions. Now the retail trade, continuing, Morris Reich, or Rich, he would change his name to Rich and would run a store in Atlanta with his brothers, which became Rich's department store. And if you remember Burdines here in Florida, Rich's kind of followed the same story, a very successful store. Federated Department Stores, which had bought Burdines in 1956, bought Rich's in 1976, and then 20 years later, Macy's bought Federated and took over the Rich's sites, put Rich's out of business, much as they did with Burdines eventually. And Dallas, Texas saw the merger of two merchants involved in various goods. Carrie Neiman, or rather Carrie Marcus, who with her brother ran a shop that specialized in elegant dresses, and she married Al Neiman. And of course, Neiman Marcus, the height of luxury. And until 1971, all the stores they had were in Texas. 1971, they opened right down the road from me in Bal Harbour, Florida, their first out of Texas store. Now they had filed for bankruptcy during the early months of COVID, but they seem to have come back. The late 1800s to the 1910s would see mass migration, of course, coming from Russia, coming from parts of Eastern Europe, more than 3 million Jews coming to the United States. And of course, while most of them would live in the New York area or the Northeast, some of them would come to southern states. And there was even something in Galveston, Texas, known as the Galveston Plan, which was an effort in the first decade of the 20th century to relocate and settle 10,000 Jews in Galveston. And as long as it had the support of various Jewish community organizations, things were going relatively swimmingly. But by about 1910, that support was starting to dry up. Anti-immigrant sentiment was starting to rise, anti-Jewish sentiment also starting to rise. And there were a number of, some of the newer immigrants at the time would be deported, but others would settle and still contribute to Galveston's community. Now, another of the darkest moments in Jewish American history involving Leo Frank, manager of a factory in Atlanta, and accused of and put on trial for and found guilty of murdering Mary Fagan, a worker in that plant. And then the story takes various turns. The governor of Georgia commuting Frank's death sentence. And then the mob deciding to act on its own and lynching Frank. Now, in I think the 1980s, his sentence was commuted. The argument being that anti-Semitism had prevented him from getting a fair trial. By the way, the descendants of the Fagan family continue to insist that Frank murdered her. There is perhaps with DNA and perhaps other forms of technology, there can be efforts to clear everything up. But a lot of people see that Frank's lynching galvanized the movement to fight anti-Semitism. And one of the byproducts of this, established by B'nai B'rith, was the creation of the Anti-Defamation League, which has its 110th anniversary this year, by the way. And here again, in the B'nai B'rith newsletter, introducing the creation of the what was called at the time the Anti-Defamation League of America. Now, one of the sons of Kentucky, born there in 1861, Louis Brandeis, who would become the first Jewish justice to the U.S. Supreme Court, appointed by President Woodrow Wilson. And facing anti-Semitism, not just from various aspects of the country, but also from a couple of his own colleagues on the Supreme Court. Some of them would not sit next to him to pose for pictures. Brandeis would be a very strong voice on the court for privacy issues and also helping to move forward civil rights with some of his rulings. Now, interestingly, with the attention that's being paid these days to business ties and others of Supreme Court justices, he was a strong advocate of the Jewish community, would retain those advocacy positions even after he was appointed to the Supreme Court, and remained an unofficial aide, kind of a listening post for both President Wilson and later on for President Franklin Roosevelt. Anita Politzer, South Carolina, the Politzer sisters of South Carolina, crusaders for children's, to help children, to improve education, and in Anita Politzer's case, for women to have the right to vote. Given the other campaigns they had to help children, they figured that one of the ways to empower women to campaign for better schools, better conditions for children, was that they could go out and vote for it. So she advocated, she's traveled through various southern states, including Florida, to speak out for women's suffrage, first individual states, and then the passage of the 19th Amendment. Florida was one of the places she came to. There were individual cities, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and others across the state that approved suffrage during the 1910s. However, the Florida legislature did not approve either a state measure or ratify the 19th Amendment. It wasn't until 1969, by the way, that the Florida legislature did a ceremonial ratification on the 50th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. She also had dinner in Tennessee with a young legislator named Harry Byrne as the Tennessee legislature was debating the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Tennessee was the state that put it over the top Harry Byrne was the vote from the Tennessee's legislators that approved it. Gertrude Whale, up the road in North Carolina, and also an advocate for suffrage. But she also, once women did get the vote, she was also an advocate for clean elections. She stood up one day publicly and took ballots that had been marked to be cast for a particular candidate, and she just tore them up. And afterwards, oh, sorry about that little label at the end. But the focus here is the note actually from Sally Cotton. Sally Cotton, another of the North Carolina suffragists. And she wrote, "I wish I could have seen it, and every woman in the state will applaud your courage and coolness." This was a letter to Gertrude Whale. "How can anyone enjoy cheating? I would not have an office that I am even suspected had been gained by fraud." And excuse me. And I love the final sentence. "I glory in your spunk." Now, Girl Scout cookies have become, of course, a national tradition and are baked, are distributed on a national basis these days. It used to be that Girl Scout cookies were prepared locally. And in the 1930s, Gottlieb's Bakery in Savannah, one of the bakeries where the order was placed, $581 for, look at this, 7,697 dozen cookies. I'm not sure of that. But here's a box from the 1930s. And Gottlieb's Bakery, owned by members of the Jewish community in Savannah, playing a role in a tradition. Now, World War II, campaign starting in earnest for the Jews of Europe to get a homeland, and Alabama became the first Southern state to advocate for a Jewish homeland. Here's a resolution approved by Alabama's government in 1943, explaining the history, explaining the Balfour Declaration, the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And this was at a circumstance, Franklin Roosevelt never said anything about it. Thomas Dewey, who was the Republican nominee first in 1944, before 1948, advocated for it soon afterward, and others started to be strong advocates as well. Now, spirits were kept up also during World War II, and one of those keeping them up was a young woman who was born Frances, or Fanny, Shore in Tennessee, and went to Vanderbilt University. As a young singer who was starting her career on the radio and with some of the big bands, she decided to take a name other than Fanny. I believe there was another singer named Fanny Shore. So she listened to the song Dinah and decided to take that name, Dinah Shore, and would act in a couple of movies, Up in Arms, in which she worked with a member of Brooklyn's Jewish community, Danny Kaye. She didn't really like appearing in movies, though, so she would stick mainly to music. Of course, in the 1950s, very famously had her first television show, variety show, the Dinah Shore Chevy Show, which she developed the reputation of blowing the audience a kiss at the end of the show. Mwah. And then by the 1970s and 80s, her chat show, usually called the Dinah Shore Show or Dinah, where she would interview a number of people. She did have one more movie appearance in the 1977 movie, Oh God, in the scene in which John Denver's character appears on her show to talk about his sighting of George Burns' version of God. And of course, she also sponsored a golf tournament whose tradition included her jumping with the winner of the golf tournament, women's golf tournament, into the water I believe at the 18th green at the end of the tournament. Now, also in Tennessee, Oak Ridge, these days, the Oak Ridge boys are best known, but during the war, a lot of military bases established secret strategy, including the Manhattan Project, which was not necessarily done in Manhattan. Oak Ridge, Tennessee was one of the secret places that was established, U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, and then Marker afterward, found in 1942. And then it was not so secret. Now, during the war, there was a family named Poplin. I believe there were 3 members of the family who went to military service. They came back, and the younger members of the family would have trouble, and their friends would have trouble finding a summer camp that could accept Jews. And it was in 1948, 75 years ago this year, that Blue Star camps established. And of course, I remember as a kid seeing the advertisements in the Jewish Floridian. So it continues with a mixture of cultural traditions, religious, entertainment, and sports. President Harry Truman, with his old Missouri haberdashery business partner, Eddie Jacobson, they met during World War I when Truman served as a captain. And Jacobson was part of that unit, became friends. However, Jacobson and his wife never ate dinner at the Truman's house, and there are questions about whether Bess Truman was anti-Semitic. Still, Eddie Jacobson proved valuable after Truman became president, and there was a campaign to establish a Jewish homeland. It was Eddie Jacobson who introduced Truman to Chaim Weizmann, then one of the strongest advocates for the Jewish state, and later the first president of Israel. Truman referred to him as Cham. And all right, is that okay? Truman referred to him as Cham and would recognize Israel roughly 10 minutes after the establishment of the state of Israel. Now, in 2004, there was discovered in Truman's diaries what he would have referred to as long-handed spasms. He would express anger towards groups, and did in this case towards, he said, the Jews. He wrote, "The Jews I find are very, very selfish." And there are questions about people he had been dealing with. I think David McCullough's biography about Truman illustrated his discuss with people such as Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, who would lose his temper in front of him. And he even expressed some anger at Eddie Jacobson at times for this. But again, he recognized Israel, and would, for the rest of his life, publicly at least, was very proud of that fact. Number of local Jewish officials in the South, 2 longtime mayors, Willie Sklar. Both of these mayors in Mississippi. The town of Louise, Willie Sklar was mayor for a long time. Sam Rosenthal, you see there a marker, 1924 to 69. And he was mayor in Rolling Fork, I'm sorry, if I should say Mississippi, if I did not. Rolling Fork, Mississippi, during a great flood that hit in 1927. Temple Emmanuel in Miami Beach. And it had been established, the genesis had happened in the 1930s as Jacob Joseph Congregation, breaking off from the Orthodox Beth Jacob as a conservative congregation, then Miami Beach Jewish Center, and then 1943, Rabbi Irving Lerman came and became the rabbi for next 50 years plus. And after buying land for $200,000 on one of the main thoroughfares in Miami Beach, they built this synagogue in 1948. From the late 50s through the early 1980s, Temple Emmanuel was regarded as the largest congregation in the South. High holy days, they would go across the street to Miami Beach Theater for their services. Again, Martin Luther King and various rabbis side by side, and rabbis across the South. In some of the bigger cities, rabbis in the South, rabbis spoke more actively and more loudly in advocating for civil rights. One of the courageous ones, though, Rabbi Perry Nussbaum in Beth Israel in Jackson, Mississippi. And what you're seeing here is a picture of Rabbi Nussbaum in his office after it has been bombed because of his advocacy of civil rights. And the temple bombed as well. And Rabbi Aris Sanders in Arkansas, who supported the Little Rock Nine, who supported Brown versus Board of Education. Now, Abe Fortas, again, talking about the Supreme Court. Fortas is a prominent lawyer. His most famous case involved Clarence Gideon in the state of Florida, who was arrested for a petty crime, could not get his own representation at the state level, and went to court. And Abe Fortas was his attorney who argued in front of the US Supreme Court. Fortas from Tennessee, as a young man, established a friendship with a rising Texas politician named Lyndon Johnson. When Johnson was president, he appointed Fortas to the Supreme Court. He wanted to appoint him as Chief Justice when after Earl Warren, but then his business ties were discovered. Fortas resigned, and that would be, again, the mixed legacy that he would have. Richard Stone, the grandson of the creator of the Blackstone Hotel, one of the hotels that broke barriers in Miami Beach. There were parts of Miami Beach that were restricted until the late 1920s. He was married to his father-in-law was the founder of Royal Castle, which had its own mixed legacies in South Florida. And then he would serve, though, with groups of progressive Democrats, many from South Florida. In Tallahassee, he served as in the legislature as Secretary of State, and then in 1974 was elected the second U.S. senator, Jewish senator from Florida, and the second senator from the South, Jewish senator from the South. He served one term, losing in 1980, but was appointed to a diplomatic position by President Jimmy Carter, continued to serve as an envoy to Central America for President Ronald Reagan, and later on was President Clinton's US ambassador to Denmark. By the way, Richard Stone, there was an exhibit about him at the Jewish Museum in Miami Beach some years ago, and when he spoke, he talked about being a kid at the Blackstone Hotel, and he and his brother would throw water balloons on the guests. Leon Levine of North Carolina, looking at a way in the late 1950s to establish the ability to buy quality items for very low prices, and established the Family Dollar Store, which spread quickly, went public in the 1970s, merged with Dollar Tree about 15 or so years ago. So still very successful. Hippie USA Home Instruction for Parents of Preschool Youngsters. This was established in Israel during the 1960s, 70s, as it was developing its education program. By the 1980s, so popular that a young governor from Arkansas named Bill Clinton was very interested in it. And he and the First Lady of Arkansas, Hillary Rodham, then as she was known at the time, went to Israel. And this would also, the relationship would help set up Clinton's national reputation as the education governor, and also to stepping stone to his work as president on the Middle East. Now you're looking here at workers from an organization called Zaka, rescuing Torahs from one of the synagogues in New Orleans that was flooded during Hurricane Katrina. Southern Jewish organizations and congregations are also dealing with emergencies, with storms, with climate issues, with other issues as well, and learning how to deal with these. Oops. Here again, a number of members of the Jewish community who have risen to national level positions. Eric Cantor in Virginia, who rose to Republican whip, third in line in the U.S. House of Representatives. Mickey Cantor, who was the trade representative during the Clinton administration. Debbie Wasserman Schultz from South Florida, the first Jewish woman to be elected to Congress from Florida. Kathy Manning, who was the head of the National Organization of Jewish Federations, and she now represents Congress from North Carolina. And the third Jewish senator from the South, John Ossoff, who was elected from Georgia in 2020. Continuing advocacy at the state level, South Carolina, first to pass landmark bill against campus anti-Semitism. This was done a couple of years ago. Kentucky also condemning anti-Semitic acts. This also from a few years ago. And a recording of Jewish history. In Alabama, a small newspaper called the Southern Shofar was started in the 1980s. It was published in different places, got different names until 2009. It became Southern Jewish Life magazine. There is a general Southern issue. There's also a weekly email that goes out, and it includes these states and the parts of Florida are the Florida Panhandle mainly, and a separate New Orleans edition. And the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, which also had a modest start in Mississippi, and expanded and opened its relatively new museum in New Orleans in just a couple of years ago. Now, we're looking at a picture of what happened in Charlottesville in 2017 and the challenges that face the Jewish community in the South today. And one of the campaigns that takes place done by Hillel. We're just 75 years since the gas chamber. So no, a billboard calling out Jew hate isn't an overreaction. That's a recent billboard. And one of the weapons against anti-Semitism is also education and education of the young people. And one of the examples of it you see here, Jackson, Mississippi, Beth Israel congregation. And a lot of smiling faces here. And as I wrap up, I'll end with a little personal touch. My last name is Gurinsky, and these are members of the Texas Gurinsky family. And in fact, there was once a member of the Gurinsky family. I think from what I understand, they're second cousins. I have never met them. I have a few Florida relatives who have been able to meet some of them. And the family now has jewelry, I think chain of jewelry stores in San Antonio. They have supported, I think there is a Gurinsky banquet hall in one of the San Antonio synagogues there. And I think one of my cousins in Palm Beach got to meet this man, Charles Gurinsky, and says he looks a lot like my dad did. So, but the family has said that they came from Lithuania, and my dad's family was from a town in what was then Poland. So we're still connecting the dots. So I will stop the share. And let me look. Okay, let's see here. And let me look at what was published in the chat and see if there were any questions. And Toro family, there's Toro family.
I won't show myself, but I'll say awesome, Sylvia. This is
Thank
Linda.
you.
Awesome, awesome.
Linda Levitt, nice to meet you. She is working on a film in Texas with Barbara Rosenthal, who moved there from Florida. And they are looking at the history, trying to get the history of Rosanna Osterman of Galveston. Joseph Cohen of Tulane wrote a lot about Southern Jewry. Go Chattanooga, Mitzpah Congregation, Reformed Congregation, has their sanctuary named after him and his wife, daughter of Isaac Mayer Wise. Okay, and thank you. Thank you, everybody. And just very quickly, does anybody have any questions?
We'll take questions now. Sylvia, by the way, we have so appreciated this. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
I've really enjoyed it. If anybody has a question, you can use your hand raising icon. We'll give just a few.
Shout out to my sister who's also listening.
All right. Well, thank you so much again. This was a wonderful part of our lecture series. We thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us for hopefully our next lecture series. And to everybody else, thank you for joining us. We'll have another episode coming up soon, and we hope to see you there as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cassidy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia.
And Linda.
Awesome as always. And I got to listen and learn, just lie here and enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you. Feel better, Linda.
Thank you. We'll talk soon.
Okay.
Bye.